Hello everybody and welcome back to Insider's Guide. Today we're revisiting one of the older Insider's Guides I've made, episode 8 about Breckenridge. It's been well over a year now and things have changed. There are some inaccuracies I would like to correct, along with going more in detail about certain areas. Obviously, if you haven't watched parts A, B, and C, you need to watch those before this, as this video is solely filling in the gaps in those ones. So with that, let's begin part D of an Insider's Guide to Ski Resorts, Breckenridge. Starting with Peak 10, I mostly covered everything I wanted to talk about in Part A, so I don't have much to add with this part of the mountain. I will say that for some reason, I found that Peak 10 has some of the roughest conditions at the resort. Therefore, on a day when good snow is scarce, I cannot recommend venturing over to Peak 10. On days when the snow is good everywhere, this is the place to be, since lift lines are always non-existent here. I also want to add that from the top of Peak 10, there's a trail that was previously removed from the trail map called Union. You can still see the outline of it on the trail map, but it's essentially a groomed road that intermediates can take to ski down from the top of Peak 10 to Upper Lehman. It was removed from the trail map to discourage intermediates from riding up Falcon Superchair, but it's still very much open to the public. Moving on to Peak 9, ever since I made Insider's Guide Episode 8 Part B, a slew of upgrades have been proposed to try and fix the absolute mess that is Peak 9. As of 2024, of all the peaks at Breckenridge, this is by far the one that's the most poorly developed, so these upgrades are definitely going to be quite helpful with overall flow across this congested part of the mountain. In order to avoid making this a full Breckenridge master plan breakdown video, we'll only be discussing the two confirmed lifts coming to Peak 9. The first lift will be a new gondola that extends from the bottom of the Quicksilver lift to a mid-station below the Falcon Superchair, and then to the top terminal of the A chair. As implied by its layout, this gondola will replace the heavily underutilized A chair and provide an alternative to the Quicksilver lift, which gets some of the worst lines on the mountain. Secondly, C chair is on track to be upgraded to a high-speed 6-pack, which will allow you to bypass the Sawmill Trail to get down to Beaver Run. I think both of these upgrades will be huge in dealing with crowds on Peak 9, especially the new gondola, but we'll have to wait until they're built to see how effective they are. Note that the top terminal of C chair will be extended slightly to provide more convenient access to the Overlook restaurant. Now, I want to talk a bit more in depth about some of the expert trails on this side of the mountain. Needle's Eye is gnarly, easily one of the most insane marked trails at the resort. Despite the lack of an extreme rating, this zone is harder than a good majority of the extreme rated lines at the resort. This is an ultra steep glade area that has some of the sketchiest snow conditions at the resort, despite its northern aspect. This is not a run to do alone, and I'd only recommend it to folks who are already comfortable with the majority of Breck's extremes. All the runs from Mineshaft to E-Lift line are very steep, bumpy, tree-cut runs. I find all of these trails much steeper than your average bump run, but they aren't all that long. Like Needle's Eye, despite their northern aspect, they tend to have some pretty awful conditions. Although it's one of the easier runs there, I'd recommend Devil's Crotch. It's one of Breck's icons for obvious reasons. Moving a bit higher on Peak 9, the Windows are my personal favorite glades on the mountain. Access to these areas come through a series of gates, the lower half of which don't mandate hiking, while the upper half requires some sidestepping. There's a separate hike that leads to the back 9 and twin chutes, which takes about 15 to 20 minutes based on your fitness. As mentioned in Part A, these runs are very underutilized and are often home to some great stashes. The only downside is that they're very short, so they may not be worth the effort to some. The run out for the Windows, twin chutes, and back 9 goes through a creek with paths on either side, so ski with control towards the bottom. Moving on to Peak 8, I made Episode 8 Part B before the Rips Ride and 5-chair upgrades. I was also unsure about whether it would still be difficult to get to 5 and 7 from the top of the gondola. I can safely say that 5 Superchair is much easier to get to and has significantly reduced congestion on both Colorado and Rocky Mountain. It also serves as the most efficient route back to Peak 9 from the bottom of Peak 8. There are still some decent lines at both 5 and Colorado on peak days, so I'd still recommend Rocky Mountain most of the time, although I will note that 5 is still better than Colorado. Note that because of the beginners it attracts, like Colorado, 5 does stop quite often. Rips Ride is still a bit hidden and requires a hike from the base. That being said, unlike Quicksilver, it doesn't have crazy lines, so if you're a beginner at Breck, I recommend starting here. I also want to mention that while these double blacks under the Super Connect can be fun in the spring, they have pretty trash snow quality during the core season since they face dead south. Moving over to Horseshoe Bowl, I want to add that in general, the middle parts of the bowl are the steepest, while the edges are the mellowest. Lulu is the steepest run here and features a really cool rock drop. Horseshoe Bowl is a bit steeper than Imperial Bowl, but not by too much. Cucumber Bowl faces south, so its snow can be variable. However, on powder days, this is a great place to explore despite it being on the mellower side. Contest Bowl is short, but has some fun little rock drops and some solid stashes here and there. A very efficient way to get from Peak 8 to 9 is via Frosty's Freeway to E-Chair, since this allows you to bypass the flatter lower sections of Sawmill. 6-Chair is a bit painful to ride, but the terrain under the lift is some of the better advanced terrain at Breck. The zone is lightly graded and a bit bumped up, and feels more unique than your standard Black Diamond Trail. In general, while the snow gets better from lookers right to left, the runs get shorter. As we previously discussed, there are two ways to access Imperial, via 6-Chair and via the T-Bar. I prefer using 6-Chair, since there seems to be less loading mishaps than the T-Bar. I did talk about Imperial in Part B, but I want to go more in depth here. Imperial Bowl is fun, but is always super busy. The snow is usually pretty smooth with all the wind, so it doesn't really get that bumpy from my experience. There can be a few exposed rocks at the top, and watch out for the rock gardens around the lift towers. The bowl is honestly pretty mellow for a double black, and is honestly only rated so for its elevation and wind exposure. That being said, I'm absolutely not suggesting that lower level skiers should come up here, since conditions can be quite harsh. Imperial Ridge is my least favorite run off Imperial, as it's super narrow and gets congested with people riding way out of their ability. Alpine Alley is essentially an extension of Imperial Ridge that brings you back to the Imperial Lift. These two trails are always groomed. I'd now like to properly dive into the infamous Lake Chute zone. The Lake Chutes offer some of the most extreme terrain at Breckenridge, although I'd say that the hardest Six Senses lines barely edge out the hardest Lake Chutes lines in difficulty. Both zones, however, are quite difficult. To reach the Lake Chutes gate, you'll have to embark on a 15 to 20 minute hike up the Imperial summit. This hike isn't too bad, but can be intimidating due to the high winds. Make sure to take it slow, especially if you're coming from sea level. From the summit of Peak 8, skiers left allows you to access the top section of Whale's Tail, while skiers right brings you to the Lake Chutes gate. Going towards Whale's Tail from up here is literally pointless and absolutely not worth doing the hike. The Lake Chutes ridge is pretty much all downhill until you come to Zoot Chute, where it becomes slightly uphill. Now we'll talk about all the marked and unmarked lines here. Easy Street is similar to Imperial Bowl, but has a small cornice at the beginning. This is by far the best place to start in the Lake Chutes. 9 Lives is like Easy Street, but with more rocks to dodge. Contrary to what I previously said, this run honestly isn't that bad when compared to some of the lines further down the ridge. Both Easy Street and 9 Lives are more like bull runs with a few obstacles thrown here and there. The remaining runs are more similar to what you typically define as a chute. There are a bunch of unmarked lines between 9 Lives and Zoot Chute. Zero Chute is primarily skied by traversing skiers right from 9 Lives, since entering from the top would require a big drop in over a rock garden. Crazy Ivan 1 and 2 have a cornice drop in, and are super steep and narrow. These are some of the most challenging Lake Chutes. Vertical Cornice has a very steep initial drop and a choke in the middle, but mellows out past the first few feet. This line becomes exponentially tougher if you include Pyramid Rock, a massive 40-foot cliff. Zoot Chute has a bit of a sketchy entrance, but is mellower than some of its neighbors. This is probably the most popular of the Lake Chutes due to its distinct profile, and it's another great first chute to attempt. Past Zoot Chute, you'll have to do some brief sidestepping to access the remaining runs. Wackies is the toughest marked Lake Chute. It has a very steep corniced entry, lots of rocks to dodge, and an ending that can require air based on snow conditions. Dwarves is the wide open face lookers left of Wackies and is a good way to bail out of skiing Wackies. Snow White is similar to the Peak 7 bowl terrain, but feels even more remote and isolated. The entrance is typically corniced, but the bowl is pretty mellow past this. The only downside is that this run can get sunbaked, so I'd recommend hitting it early in the day. If you're looking for a run that feels like the backcountry within the bounds of Breck, Snow White won't disappoint. Despite being on Peak 7, the Peak 7 bowl terrain is actually only accessible from Peak 8 because it requires a ride up both the T-Bar and Imperial to lap. George's Thumb is just a wide open bowl. It's reminiscent of Imperial, just longer. Whale's Tail is the most popular run here due to its central location. It has a small cornice at the top that you can easily bypass depending on where you drop in. Past Whale's Tail, the ridge starts sloping upwards and you'll have to begin sidestepping a bit. Peak 7 Bowl is super wide open at the top and filters down into these various lines from Debbie's Alley to Arts Bowl. Vertigo is the most commonly traveled route, so I try to avoid it. Y Shoot, CJ's, and Magic Carpet are all much better options. In general, with Peak 7 Bowl, the further lookers right you go, the better the snow. Arts Bowl, for this very reason, typically has the best snow. Whiskey River and the Dunes bring you to Peak 6, although it is possible to traverse back to Peak 7. Honestly, I don't know enough about these runs to talk about them, so if someone's done them, leave your thoughts in the comments. Skipping lower Peak 7 and moving on to Peak 6, Bliss and Reverie are frequently groomed, although this isn't always the case. The remaining Peak 6 blues are on rotational grooming and are on the steeper side for blues at Breckenridge. Pat's Wonderland, formerly just Wonderland, is a heavily underutilized bowl area that's often home to some great snow. In terms of difficulty, this one's very similar to Imperial Bowl. The Peak 6 hike is longer than the Peak 8 hike, but is still reasonable. It takes roughly 30 minutes for the average person, but it's entirely based on your fitness. From the summit of Peak 6, Skiers Left allows you to access the Beyond Bowl terrain, and Skiers Right allows you to access the Serenity Bowl and Six Senses zone. Note that the ridge above Serenity Bowl and the Six Senses requires a lot more catwalking than the Lake Chutes ridge. Serenity Bowl is very similar to Easy Street in the Lake Chutes, but is slightly steeper and has a larger cornice drop-in. There can be a few fun rock drops to hit, and in general, the runs get harder from lookers right to left. The Six Senses is easily home to the most challenging terrain at Breckenridge. Think of the Lake Chutes, but longer, steeper, and more technical. Echo and Behold are like much gnarlier versions of Serenity Bowl. Proper route scoping is a must here, since it's easy to get cliffed out. However, I do recommend traversing past these runs for some even more unique terrain. The chutes past this point require some additional hiking and sidestepping to reach, but it only takes an additional 5 minutes tops and is well worth it. Whiff is the toughest marked trail at Breckenridge. It's just super tight and all around gnarly. Savor and Contact are only tough if you ski them from the very top. Both entrances have super steep cornices and a very tight choke that may not be skiable if conditions are unfavorable. You can traverse to the lower half of both Contact and Savor from ESP, which definitely makes things a lot easier. The remainder of Savor is basically like a tighter version of ESP. Past the entrance, Contact is wide open but filters into a very tight corridor known as Tidy Whitey. ESP is the best intro line to this zone. It's your classic couloir with a steep drop-in. This is a great run, one of the best at Breckenridge. I don't really recommend any of the terrain past ESP as, in my opinion, it's not worth the effort. They also face slightly south, so the snow can be on the rougher side. Finally, Beyond Bowl is usually home to some of the best snow at the resort, but I don't find the terrain very interesting compared to Serenity Bowl and especially the Six Senses. That being said, it's a great place to get some untracked POW to yourself when conditions are good. I definitely recommend traversing as close to breathless as possible for the freshest snow. Beyond Bowl filters onto Intuition, which, as we mentioned, requires a very short catwalk at the bottom to get back to the Kensho lift. Okay, that about wraps it up for Breckenridge. I hope that this helps, and as always, please leave any questions down below. Go check out another episode of Insider's Guide, perhaps another recently amended episode such as Beaver Creek. Thank you all so much for watching. All my love, I'm out.